Welcome to HealthVision, WOUB's program on medicine and health. I'm your host, Jackie Wolf, Associate Professor of Social Medicine at Ohio University. Today's show is the first of a two-part series on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Joining us to discuss ADHD are psychologist Fred Krieg, Program Director of the School Psychology Department at Marshall University, Well-Child Nurse Coordinator Sue Meeks from Ohio University, and Roger Wilkens, Director of the Dogwood Center for Self-Development. It's really a pleasure to have all three of you here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fred, let me ask you, we hear so much about ADHD, and I think people could vaguely describe what it is, but tell us exactly what is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
Well, first of all, it's a neurological condition, primarily associated with frontal lobe dysfunction, in which people have and that's children and adults, we used to think it was a childhood disease, have problems with impulsivity, short attention span, distractibility. It is a problem of retrieval, not of input. We used to think ADHD was that the kid didn't get the information in right. What we now know is that the child or the adult cannot retrieve the information when they want to retrieve the information.
Is this a new disorder? I mean, when I was growing up, we didn't hear about ADHD. Why suddenly does it seem to be a problem? Why is it being diagnosed? Why does it have a name? And when did this come about?
First diagnosis of attention deficit disorder, not called that, was in 1902 by somebody named George Still. It became very popular when we had encephalitis epidemics in the 1930s, but it really became popular in the 60s and 70s when educational demands increased in the classroom, and there was a expectation that all children will learn and that schools will be much more rigorous. Then all of a sudden became an emphasis on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It then kind of lay dormant for a while in the 80s. And then in 1991, Alan Zamotkin at the National Institute of Mental Health did some landmark research which then put a biological basis to ADHD.
Before we talk about the biological basis, because you mentioned schools and how education changed a bit and how the demands of education made ADHD kind of highlighted it. And let me ask you, Roger, because you were a principal of a school for a very long time, and let me ask you how ADHD does manifest itself among school children and why is it problematic?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was the director of a rather progressive school that often received children who were escaping from the public school because the system was becoming more and more structured and rigid, and there was greater insistence that everyone stay in their desk and focus more and more attention on task and less opportunity for play and for expressive activity. And so a number of the children who came to our school were sort of refugees from public school, and we had an environment where children had a great deal more latitude to engage in long-term projects that interest them, which is essential in terms of dealing with ADHD, that children can focus on something they're interested in, but when you give them uninteresting things in their terms, their attention soon strays.
So in some ways, this is really a disorder of context. I mean, the disorder in some sense can even disappear or at least be mitigated in a different kind of context.
Very interestingly, there's a writer, Richard Louv, who has just come out with a book called The Last Child in the Woods, in which he argues that the cultural transition from agricultural society to the highly electronic, urbanized society we have now is taking children out of the natural context. The children no longer go out and spend an afternoon in the woods, playing in creek beds, building things, doing things that were naturally engaging for them. Instead, they're in an environment where they're looking for the nearest place they can plug in their electronic device. And he quotes research recently published in, I think it was the American Journal of Public Health, a rather extensive study showing children who who are diagnosed ADHD were taken out of the urban environment and placed in a rural environment, and their symptoms diminished dramatically.
And Sue, let's talk about symptoms a little bit. Can you describe some symptoms of ADHD? What do people look for? What do parents see and then think, oh dear, does my child have it? Or what do teachers see and think, oh, maybe this child is ADHD?
My information comes so much from my parents because they come in and they're able to tell me what they see, what the schools are complaining about.
The parents of the children you're talking about.
Right. I never see the children. I only talk to the parents, which is interesting because I don't get the picture of the child except for through their eyes. But many parents tell me that they are there because the teachers have said they needed to be, that the child needs medication to be in school. And from the teacher's perspective, it's that they're not able to stay on task. They can't complete their work. It takes them a long time to finish a project. They can't find anything. They talk out in class. They disrupt class. So that's the school side of it. What I hear the parents telling me is that they have to tell them over and over and over to do something. Pick up your shoes, take out, the trash, whatever it is. That there is never just a tell them one time and they remember it. It is constant, repeated messages, and the same with discipline, that you can't ask them one time, you have to ask them many, many times. So the complaints and the symptoms I get are different from the school often than they are from the parents.
Fred, let me go back to you, because it's interesting that we hear a little bit about it can change in context. We hear something about the symptoms, and you were saying that there's evidence now that this is biologically based.
Correct.
Describe that a little bit more, what you mean by that.
Well, let me do two things. I want to do it also in context to what Sue said. In 1991, Alan Zamotkin published a very famous study out of the National Institute of Mental Health, in which he documented that ADHD was a disorder of the frontal lobe by doing PET scan studies. And I hope Roger later will talk a little bit about the work he's doing in the frontal lobe. But we know, a book I wrote in 1975 talked about ADHD being a problem of the reticular activating system.
Which is what?
Which is a lower part of the brainstem, and that's what we thought. It's kind of where the brake and the gas pedal are in the child. And we used to think ADHD was a disorder where the brake wasn't working. And so we would give them psychostimulants to make the brake work to control the impulsivity behavior. That's what I wrote in chapter 4 of that book, which I would be happy to buy back because it's all wrong. In 1991, Zamotkin said, no, it's not in the reticular activating system. It's clearly in the frontal lobe. And as Roger will talk later, I'm sure, we now are working on frontal lobe functioning in these children, both through medication and through other situations. What's really interesting is what Sue commented about with parents. Parents come in and say, the child has memory, doesn't remember, you have to tell them 1,000,000 times. When you actually talk to an ADHD child, he will say, they'll run across the street and you'll say, what did I tell you? And they'll say, the rule is don't cross the street without waiting for me. Why didn't you do it? I didn't think of it. ADHD is the inability to retrieve information from the frontal lobe when you need to do it. It's not that it isn't there. What frustrates parents is, I know he knows it. He doesn't do what he knows because the child can't retrieve it, and that's a frontal lobe function.